The silence in the garage that morning was the wrong kind of silence. Not the kind that settles after a long day, when the compressor shuts off and the fluorescent lights stop buzzing and the whole building exhales. This was heavier than that. This was the silence of something broken that had been broken for a very long time and had stopped asking to be fixed. Weston Hale had been standing in front of the car for 4 minutes before he realized he hadn't moved. He'd walked in at 6:15 like he did every morning, set his coffee on the workbench, and just stood there, staring at it. The car was a 1989 Ferrari Testarossa, Rosso Corsa red, tan leather interior with less than 12,000 original miles. It belonged to a man named Aldrich Beaumont, and Aldrich Beaumont was the kind of man who collected things he didn't fully understand, which was perhaps the most honest thing you could say about him. The car had not started in 6 years. 6 years. Weston knew this because Aldrich had told him in the particular way that very wealthy people tell you unpleasant facts. Not as confessions, but as weather reports. It's been 6 years, he'd said, and 3 specialists before you, and none of them could figure it out. So I don't expect you to either, but someone in town said you were good with old machines. And here we are. Here they were. Weston pulled a shop stool close and sat down in front of the car the way you'd sit across from someone you needed to get to know. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. Outside, through the single window above his pegboard of hand tools, the sky was still gray. It was October in Millhaven, Wyoming, and the aspens on the ridge had already gone yellow, and the cold came in under the garage door in slow, thin fingers every morning, no matter how many times he re-weather stripped it. His daughter, Blythe, was still asleep in the apartment above. She was 9 years old, and she had her mother's way of sleeping, deep and total, one arm flung sideways, completely unreachable. Weston usually had 2 hours alone in the garage before he needed to go up and make her breakfast and walk her to the bus stop on Callaway Road. He used those 2 hours well. He'd been an engineer once, senior level at a firm in Denver that built performance systems for high-end manufacturers. He'd had a salary and an office with a window that looked south toward the mountains and a team of 12 people who reported to him. That was before. Before Jenny. Before the accident on I-70 3 years ago on a March afternoon when the roads were wet, and the other driver didn't see her until it was too late. After that, things had simplified. That was the only word for it that didn't destroy him to say out loud. He'd sold the house, taken Blythe out of her school, moved back to Millhaven, where his uncle had left him a building on the edge of town with a 2-bay garage on the ground floor and a livable apartment above it. He'd gotten his mechanic's license, told no one about the engineering background, and started fixing cars. He was good at it. He was good at it the way some people are good at things that look simple from the outside but aren't, and he mostly kept that to himself. The Ferrari sat there, red and silent and waiting. He set down his coffee and started. Aldrich Beaumont did not live in Millhaven. He lived 30 miles east, in the larger town of Creighton Falls, in a house that had been featured in a regional architecture magazine and which he mentioned at every opportunity. He had made his money in commercial real estate, and later in something involving natural gas rights. And he wore that money the way some men wear a watch, constantly and facing outward. He'd had the Ferrari trailered to Weston's garage on a Tuesday in September. Weston had watched the flatbed back slowly down his driveway and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, which was a problem that was genuinely interesting. The car had been to 3 shops before his. A Ferrari specialist in Denver who'd replaced the fuel pump and the fuel pressure regulator and charged Aldrich $11,000 and returned the car in exactly the same condition it had arrived. A vintage car restoration shop in Santa Fe that had the car for 4 months, during which time they replaced various seals, cleaned the fuel injectors, rebuilt the throttle body, and ultimately wrote Aldrich a letter explaining that they believed the issue was electrical in nature, but beyond their capacity to diagnose. And finally, a man in Scottsdale who was considered an oracle among a certain class of Ferrari collector, who had the car for 6 weeks, drove it around his property on a golf cart battery just to hear the engine's compression, and sent it back with a handwritten note that said, "I don't know." And I don't say that often. Aldrich had shown Weston all 3 invoices. Together they came to just under $31,000. Weston had looked at the invoices for a long moment and then handed them back. "What do you want me to do with those?" he asked. "I want you to understand," Aldrich said. The seriousness of what we're dealing with. I understand the seriousness, Weston said. What he didn't say was, I understand it better than any of them did, because what he saw in those invoices, reading carefully between the lines of the politely professional language, was 3 shops that had been guessing. Educated guessing, confident guessing, expensive guessing, but guessing. None of them had gone back far enough. None of them had asked the right first question. He didn't say that either. He just nodded and told Aldrich he'd be in touch. The Testarossa's flat 12 engine was a magnificent thing. Weston had read about them as a young man, had studied them in technical manuals the way other people read novels, with complete absorption and a particular pleasure in the details. The engine was mid-mounted, positioned behind the seats but ahead of the rear axle, with the gearbox integrated, and the whole assembly producing a sound, when it ran, that was less like a car engine and more like a very large and very serious musical instrument reaching its full range. When it didn't run, it just sat there, inert, embarrassingly still. The first thing Weston did was nothing. He sat with it for 2 mornings, didn't touch it, just walked around it slowly with his coffee, crouched beside it, looked underneath it with a flashlight, opened the engine cover and looked at the 12 cylinders laid out in their 2 banks of 6, and thought about everything the previous shops had already ruled out. On the 3rd morning, he brought a yellow legal pad and a pen, and he wrote at the top what they didn't check. It took him 20 minutes to fill the page, not because there were so many exotic possibilities, because the answer, he was increasingly certain, was something ordinary, something that looked like nothing, the kind of fault that announces itself clearly once you know where to look and is invisible until you do. He started at the beginning. Not the beginning the other shops had started from. Not the fuel system, not the injection, not the obvious mechanical suspects. He started earlier. He went back to the car's electrical architecture, to the ECU that controlled ignition timing, to the ground circuits that the Ferrari's factory wiring diagram described in language that required both the original Italian manual and the English translation to fully parse. He found a Bosch KE Jetronic service guide from 1988. He found a forum thread from 2009 where a man in the Netherlands had described a similar symptom on a related chassis and solved it through a method that involved the CISE Lambda controller and a failed oxygen sensor signal that was intermittently grounding against the chassis in a way that confused the mixture control unit into believing the engine was perpetually flooded. The thread was 37 posts long. The solution was in post 34. Weston printed it out and put it on his workbench and read it 4 times. Then he started checking. Blythe came downstairs on a Saturday morning in mid-October, when the frost was still on the ground and the garage was cold enough that Weston could see his breath. She was wearing her mother's old flannel shirt over her pajamas, which she did sometimes, and she had her homework folder under her arm and her hair loose and tangled, and she stood in the doorway between the garage and the stairwell for a moment, looking at the red car. "Is it still broken?" she asked. "Still working on it," Weston said from underneath the rear passenger side. "You've been working on it for a while." "I know." She came inside and sat on the old wooden stool near the workbench, the one with the cracked vinyl seat that he kept meaning to replace. She opened her homework folder and started on something. He could hear her pencil moving, the small sound of her erasing. She didn't talk much when she worked, which was something she'd had since she was very small, this capacity for quiet concentration, and Weston loved it about her with a fierceness that sometimes surprised him. He kept working. They stayed like that for an hour. Him on his back under the Ferrari, her doing long division at the workbench. The garage smelled of motor oil and cold concrete and the faint, sweet chemical scent of the flux paste he'd been using to check a solder joint he'd found in the wiring harness behind the instrument cluster. A joint that looked sound but wasn't, that had been flexing minutely for years in the heat and vibration of the engine compartment until the connection became intermittent and then unreliable. And finally, at some point no one could pinpoint, effectively useless. The joint was a factory defect, not a recall, not documented anywhere he'd been able to find. Just a bad day on the assembly line in Maranello in 1989, a single solder joint made by someone who was possibly rushing, possibly distracted, possibly just having the kind of day everyone has occasionally, and that bad day had followed this car across decades, and across owners, and across $31,000 in diagnostic work, and had never once been found. He found it on a Wednesday. He didn't say anything when he found it. He just lay there for a moment, staring at it with his flashlight, and felt something move through him that wasn't quite triumph. It was more like recognition. Like seeing an old acquaintance from a long distance and knowing, before you can make out their face, that you know them. He took photographs. He documented everything. He wrote it all down on the legal pad with the specific and careful language of an engineer who knows exactly what he found and exactly why it mattered. Then he went upstairs and made Blythe's lunch for the next day and watched the evening news and went to bed at 10. The repair itself took 4 hours once he had the right part. He sourced a replacement solder and re-ran 3 inches of the affected harness with mil-spec wire he ordered from an automotive electrical supplier in Colorado Springs. He also replaced the oxygen sensor and inspected the lambda controller and cleaned every ground point in the rear engine bay with a wire brush until the metal was bright. He worked on a Thursday morning while Blythe was at school. When he was finished, he sat in the driver's seat for the first time. The leather was stiff from years of disuse, but the seat held him properly, the way a well-made thing holds you even after long neglect. He adjusted the mirrors out of habit. He put both hands on the steering wheel at 9 and 3. He turned the key. The engine caught on the second attempt. What happened next was not the gentle sound of a car starting. It was something else. It was 12 cylinders of a flat engine coming back from years of silence, all at once. A deep mechanical thunder that climbed rapidly into something that was more feeling than sound, that came up through the floor of the garage and through the seat and into his hands on the wheel, and he had to consciously remind himself not to rev it, not yet, to let it idle, to let the oil pressure build, and the temperature climb slowly, and the whole breathing living system find its rhythm again. He sat there for a moment, the garage filled with sound. Outside, through the thin gap at the bottom of the door, he could see the thin line of October sky, pale blue and cold and going on forever. He turned the engine off, sat in the silence that followed. Then he got out, closed the door, picked up his legal pad, and called Aldrich Beaumont. Aldrich drove out from Creighton Falls the next morning in a silver Mercedes that cost more than Weston's building. He arrived at 9 o'clock, which was 15 minutes later than he'd said he would, and he walked into the garage in the particular way he had, looking around at everything with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was related to it. The expression of a man who is constantly comparing what he sees to what he expected and finding the gap worth noting. He looked at the Ferrari. He looked at Weston. "You said you fixed it," he said. "I did," Weston said. There was a pause. Aldrich looked at the car again, as though he was waiting for it to confirm this independently. "The others said the same thing," he said. "I know," Weston said, "but they hadn't fixed it." There was something in his voice that made Aldrich look at him more carefully. Not the content of the words, the delivery, the flat, quiet certainty of it. Aldrich was a man who dealt constantly in confidence, who could read the difference between the confidence of someone who was certain and the confidence of someone who needed you to believe they were. He'd made a great deal of money from that skill. He looked at Weston for a moment. "All right," he said, "show me." Weston handed him the legal pad. Aldrich took it, looked at it. He turned a page, he turned another. He was not a technical man, and most of what was written there he couldn't follow, but the format of it, the systematic, documented logic of it, the photographs stapled to the back pages, the part numbers and dates, and specific measurements, carried its own kind of language, and he understood that language. He handed the pad back. "Can we start it?" he asked. Weston got in the driver's seat. Blythe had asked to come, and she was standing in the doorway to the stairwell in her weekend jeans and her blue jacket, watching. He hadn't told her she could stay. He also hadn't told her she had to go upstairs. She understood, without being told, that this was a moment that required stillness, and she was still. He turned the key. The flat 12 woke up. The sound it made was immediate and total, filling the two-bay garage from floor to ceiling, bouncing off the concrete walls, spilling out under the door into the cold morning air. It was the sound of something long silent finding its voice, and it was, in its particular way, beautiful. Aldrich Beaumont stood in front of the car with his hands at his sides, and his mouth slightly open, and on his face was an expression that Weston had not seen there before, which was something unguarded, something that looked, briefly, like a man being reminded of why he'd wanted the car in the first place. From the doorway, Blythe watched. She didn't say anything. She put her hand up to the door frame, and she watched her father in the driver's seat of the red car that everyone had said couldn't be fixed, and she watched the man who owned it standing in front of it with his mouth slightly open, and she understood something, maybe not in words, but in the particular way children understand things that matter. The engine ran. Aldrich Beaumont paid the invoice without discussion. The invoice was for $1,240, which included parts and labor and a detailed written report of the fault and the repair, formatted with the same care Weston had once used on engineering documents that went to manufacturer review boards. Aldrich looked at the total for a moment. "That's less than I expected," he said. "It's what it costs," Weston said. There was a pause. "The man in Denver charged me $11,000, Aldrich said. "I know," Weston said. "I read the invoice." Another pause. "He didn't find it," Aldrich said. "No," Weston said. "He didn't." Aldrich looked at him again with that careful look. "What did you do before this?" he asked. Not rudely, genuinely. "This," Weston said. Aldrich seemed to consider pushing further and then decided against it. He folded the invoice once and put it in his jacket pocket. He shook Weston's hand. He had the Ferrari trailered back to Creighton Falls that afternoon by a service he called himself, a professional outfit with an enclosed trailer, nothing like the flatbed it had arrived on. Before he left, standing beside the Mercedes, he turned back. "How did you know where to look?" he asked. Weston thought about it for a moment. He thought about the 2009 forum thread and the man in the Netherlands and the specific language of the factory wiring diagram and the 37 posts and the answer in post 34. He thought about 2 mornings of doing nothing, just looking and thinking. He thought about the yellow legal pad and the question at the top. What they didn't check. "I started from the beginning," he said, "not the beginning they started from." The actual beginning. Aldrich nodded slowly as though this answered a question he'd been asking himself for 6 years. He got in his car and drove away. That evening, after dinner, after Blythe had done her homework and had her bath and was in bed, reading the way she did every night with her back against the headboard and her book held up in both hands, Weston sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of him and looked out the window at the darkness over the ridge. The aspens were bare now. The season had turned. He thought about Jenny sometimes in exactly this kind of moment. The quiet moments after the work was done and before sleep, the moments that had no specific task to fill them. He thought about her the way he'd come to think about her in the 3 years since, which was not with the sharp, gutting grief of the first year, but with something softer and more permanent, the way you carry something you know you'll always carry. She would have liked today, he thought, not for the reasons most people would have guessed. Not because of the car, or the money, or Aldrich Beaumont's expression when the engine started. She would have liked it because of Blythe standing in the doorway in her blue jacket with her hand on the doorframe. She would have liked that Blythe saw it. He got up and rinsed his mug and turned off the kitchen light. In the garage below, through the floor, through the concrete and the insulation and the space between, there was nothing. No car, no problem unsolved. Just the empty bay, swept clean, the pegboard tools in their places, the workbench clear except for his coffee mug from the morning. He went to bed. At 6:15 the next morning, he came down the stairs, picked up his mug, filled it, and stood in the middle of the empty garage in the gray October light. It was quiet. The right kind of quiet this time. The kind that comes after something has been resolved. The kind that has weight to it, but the good kind of weight. The weight of finished work, of problems met and answered, of a thing returned to what it was meant to be. He drank his coffee. Outside, over the ridge, the sky went slowly from gray to pale gold, the way it does in Wyoming in October when the cold is clean, and the air is thin, and the light comes in low and sideways, and makes everything it touches look like it was worth the trouble. He thought, what's next? Not as a question, as a habit, as the particular readiness of a person who knows that something will come, and is not afraid of it, and is, in fact, quietly glad. The day opened up around him, unhurried and full of itself, and he let it.